She stood in the middle of the ballroom, every candle in Thornton estate burning bright around her, and she did not cry. Nicholas Thornton had just walked through those doors with another woman on his arm on their wedding anniversary, and every soul in that room held their breath waiting for Sophia to shatter. Instead, she pulled the gold band from her finger. She pressed it into his palm. "Keep your ring," and she walked out. If you've ever loved someone who stopped seeing you, stay with us and subscribe, because this story is for every woman who finally chose herself. Virginia had seen hard winters and harder men, but the spring of 1818 carried a particular cruelty dressed up as celebration. The Thornton estate sat 3 miles east of Charlottesville, past the iron gate that Nicholas's grandfather had commissioned from a Richmond blacksmith in 1791. The house itself was the kind of place that made strangers slow their horses without meaning to 4 white columns along the front porch, twin chimneys rising above the roofline, a gravel drive that swept in a long, graceful arc from the road. 40 acres of tobacco flanked the eastern fields. Another 60 of mixed pasture and grain ran west toward the creek. There were 12 full-time workers on the property, and 4 household staff, 2 carriages in the stable, and a breeding stallion named Colonel that Nicholas had paid $600 for out of a Kentucky sale 3 years prior. By every measure that Virginia society used to take the worth of a man, Nicholas Thornton was considerable. Sophia Sinclair had understood all of that when she married him 5 years ago. She had understood the weight of his name, the breadth of his land, and the ambition that lived behind his brown eyes, like a fire that never quite banked down to embers. She had been 23. He had been 32. Her father, James Sinclair, had managed a modest 200-acre property 12 miles north. And when Nicholas Thornton came calling that autumn, with his hat in his hands and his shoulders squared, like a man accustomed to getting what he decided to want, James Sinclair had shaken his hand before Sophia had finished reading the letter of introduction. She had not been sold. She wanted people to understand that later, when they tried to simplify the whole story into something tidier than it was. She had chosen Nicholas. She had loved the steadiness of him, the way he moved through a room, like he knew exactly where the floor was under his feet, the way he talked about the land not as property but as something living that required his attention and his care. She had believed, in those early months, that she was the same to him, something living that required his attention and his care. That belief had taken 5 years to die completely. The anniversary celebration had been Sophia's idea, or rather, it had begun as her idea, before Nicholas had taken it over the way he took over most things, quietly and thoroughly, until the original shape of the thing was gone, and only his version remained. She had imagined something small, a dinner for close family, perhaps the Hargrove cousins from Fredericksburg, a few of the neighbors whose company she genuinely enjoyed. A quiet evening. An acknowledgement had invited 60 people. He had arranged for a string quartet from Richmond. He had ordered wine from a merchant in Alexandria, French stock that had cost more than Sophia spent on household provisions in 3 months. He had instructed Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, to have the ballroom opened and the chandelier cleaned and the floors waxed to a shine that Sophia could nearly see her own face in when she walked through the afternoon before the guests arrived. "It's a great deal of fuss," she had said to him that afternoon, standing in the doorway of the ballroom while Mrs. Pratt directed 2 of the younger workers with long tapers, lighting the outer rings of candles. Nicholas had adjusted his cufflinks without looking up. "People expect a certain standard from us." Sophia had watched him for a moment. Not with anger, not yet. Just with the particular quality of attention a woman develops after 5 years of cataloging the small ways a man reveals himself. "From us," she had repeated. "From the estate." He had said, which was a different thing entirely. And they both knew it. And neither of them said so. The guests began arriving at 7. By 8, the ballroom held more people than Sophia had spoken to in the preceding 6 months combined. She moved through the room the way she had learned to move gracefully, without urgency, stopping at the right intervals to receive compliments and deflect questions and make each person feel briefly that they were the most important individual in her field of vision. It was a skill her mother had tried to teach her, and that she had only actually learned in the first year of her marriage. When she realized that being Nicholas Thornton's wife required its own particular kind of work, constant and invisible, The way the roots of a tree do their work beneath the surface where nobody sees. Margaret Hargrove found her near the window at 8:30, a glass of wine in each hand, her broad face warm with the pleasure of a woman who genuinely loved a party. You look beautiful, Sophia. Thank you, Margaret. Sophia accepted the glass. I'm glad you made the trip. Wouldn't miss it. Margaret leaned in slightly, the way she always did when she was about to say something that she'd been holding all evening. That's not nothing. In this county. In any county. Sophia smiled. It isn't. Nicholas should know what he has. Margaret said it simply, without particular weight. The way people say things that are true and kind without understanding that they've also said something devastating. Some men need reminding. Sophia looked across the room to where Nicholas stood with Thomas Caldwell and two men she didn't recognize. All four of them, carrying the posture of important business being conducted at a celebration, where important business was supposed to be set aside. Nicholas had his back to her. She had been watching his back, she thought, for most of the evening. Some do, she said, and took a sip of wine. He came through the front door at 9:15. Sophia heard the shift in the room before she saw the cause of it, that particular change in the texture of crowd sound, when individual conversation drops half a register and the general noise thins out like water finding a crack. She turned from the group she'd been speaking with, the Caldwell wives and a younger woman whose name she'd already lost, and she looked toward the entrance hall. Nicholas walked in. He was dressed impeccably, dark coat, ivory cravat, the gold watch chain that had belonged to his father catching the candlelight from the hall sconces. He walked with the easy, long-limbed confidence that she had once found so compelling, the stride of a man who expects rooms to accommodate him. He was not alone. The woman beside him was named Catherine Voss. Sophia had known her name for 4 months. She had learned it the way women learn these things, not from their husbands, but from the careful silences of the people around them, from the slight hesitations before answers, from the way conversations shifted when she entered certain rooms. Catherine Voss was 24 years old, the daughter of a merchant from Richmond, who had recently expanded his interests into tobacco brokering, which made him newly useful to landowners of Nicholas's kind. She was dark-haired and striking, and she wore a green silk gown that cost more than Sophia's entire wardrobe for the previous year. And she held Nicholas Thornton's arm with the particular ease of a woman who had been holding it in private long enough that the public version felt natural. The room went quiet, not entirely. There was still the music. The quartet had not yet understood what was happening, and there were still the sounds of glasses and movement and the fire in the hearth. But the human sound dropped, and in that drop Sophia felt 60 pairs of eyes find her. She stood very still. Inside her chest, something that had been straining for a very long time went suddenly, completely silent, the way a rope goes silent in the moment after it snaps. Nicholas met her eyes across the ballroom. He did not look ashamed. That was the thing she would remember longest later, when she tried to reconstruct the sequence of those minutes, not the humiliation of it, not the audience, not even Catherine Voss's expression, which was carefully neutral in the way of a woman who has prepared for this moment. What she would remember was that Nicholas Thornton looked at her from across his own ballroom, on their wedding anniversary, with another woman on his arm, and his expression held no shame whatsoever. What it held, she thought, was expectation. He expected her to absorb it, to find a way, as she had always found a way, to smooth the surface of things and carry forward. He expected her to be gracious and composed, and to somehow fold this moment into the household of their life together without making it a rupture, because that was what Sophia Sinclair Thornton did. That was what she had always done. She felt her right hand move to her left. She felt her fingers find the ring, the gold band he had placed there 5 years ago in a church 12 miles north. With her father watching and his mother weeping quietly in the front pew and the early autumn sun coming through the high windows in long slanted bars of light. She had been so certain that morning. She had been so completely, devastatingly certain. She pulled the ring from her finger. The quartet had stopped playing. She didn't know exactly when. The room was entirely terribly quiet. She walked toward him, the crowd parted. She would remember that too, how they stepped aside without her having to ask, as if even 60 well-dressed Virginia strangers understood that what was moving through them was something that required space. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the slight tightening around his jaw, the first crack in the expectation. Catherine Voss had taken one small step backward, though her hand was still at Nicholas's elbow. Sophia opened her palm. The ring caught the light from the chandelier above this chandelier that had been cleaned this afternoon. At his instruction, to impress these people. At this party he had built not to honor 5 years of their marriage, but to display the Thornton name to 60 guests who would go home and talk about it. She placed the ring into his hand. "Keep your ring." Her voice was steady. She had not known until the words came out whether it would be. But it was steady and it was clear, and it carried in the silence of that room to every person present. Nicholas's fingers closed around it. His expression had changed, the expectation was gone, replaced by something she couldn't immediately name, something that moved through confusion and arrived somewhere near alarm. Sophia, she turned and walked to the entrance hall. She took her cloak from the hook by the door herself, without waiting for anyone to bring it. She opened the door and she stepped out into the cool Virginia night, and she did not look back. She had driven herself. That had been a point of quiet friction earlier in the afternoon. Nicholas had assumed she would ride with him in the primary carriage, and she had said simply that she preferred to drive herself. And he had looked at her with a mild irritation that said clearly he found the preference inconvenient and somewhat embarrassing, without him quite being able to articulate why. She was grateful for it now. The horse, a bay mare named Pearl that she had chosen and trained herself over the past 2 years, stood quietly in the side yard where the stable hand had left her. Sophia untied her, checked the harness by feel in the darkness, climbed up to the seat. She did not drive fast. The road north was familiar enough that she could have managed it blindfolded, and she had no particular need for speed. What she needed was the movement, the physical fact of going, the sense of the night air and the horse's steady rhythm beneath her, and the road unreeling into the darkness ahead. She was approximately a mile from the estate when she stopped. Not because she wanted to go back. She pulled Pearl to a halt at the edge of the north road, and she sat there in the darkness, for what might have 5 minutes or 20, and she breathed. The ring was gone from her finger. She kept touching the place where it had been, an unconscious gesture, the way your tongue finds a gap in your teeth. The skin beneath was paler than the skin around it. She'd noticed this in the past. In the rare moments she'd taken the ring off, this ghostly band of lighter skin where the gold had sat for 5 years, protected from the sun. It would darken in time. That, she thought, was probably true of most things. She had known about Catherine Voss for 4 months, as she'd said. What she had not known until tonight was what she intended to do with that knowledge. In those 4 months, she had turned the question over with the same careful, systematic attention she brought to everything, the way she balanced the household accounts, the way she assessed the condition of the fields each spring before the planting decisions were made. She had looked at it from every angle she could reach. There were arguments for patience. They were not trivial arguments. 5 years of marriage was not nothing. There was Daniel, their son, 4 years old, and currently asleep nursery at Thornton Estate, with his nurse watching over it, unaware that his parents' lives were restructuring themselves tonight while he dreamed whatever 4-year-olds dream. There was the practical reality of a woman's position in Virginia in 1818, which was not an abstraction, but a series of specific, concrete constraints that had nothing to do with what she deserved, and everything to do with what the law said she owned, which was almost nothing. And there was, if she was entirely honest with herself, the piece of her that had continued, past all evidence, to believe that the man she had married existed somewhere inside. The man Nicholas had become, that fire she had seen in him in those early years, the genuine fire, the one that had seemed to include her, might still be banked down there beneath the ambition and the comfortable assumption of her presence. Tonight had resolved that question, not because he had brought Catherine Voss to the anniversary celebration. That was humiliation, and humiliation she had survived before. What had resolved it was his expression when their eyes met across the ballroom. The absence of shame, the presence of expectation. He had looked at her the way a man looks at furniture. Reliable, useful, expected to be there. She touched the bare place on her finger again. Pearl shifted her weight, quite at breath, into the darkness. "All right," Sophia said aloud. "To the horse. To the spring night and the road north, and the life that was waiting on the other side of whatever came next." She clicked her tongue. Pearl moved. Her father's property, her property now, though the legal situation was entangled in ways that would require untangling, was 12 miles north. The Sinclair land had sat mostly idle since James Sinclair's death 2 years ago, managed in the loose and inattentive way of property that belongs to someone who cannot quite bring themselves to sell it, but cannot quite figure out what to do with it either. Sophia had been out to see it 4 times since her father's death, each visit more discouraging than the last. The main house needed work. The tenant farmer who'd been managing the North Field had moved his family to Kentucky the previous autumn without significant notice. The equipment was aging, but it was standing. The land was standing, and the house was standing. And both of them were hers in a way that Thornton Estate had never been. She understood now. Never would be. She arrived near midnight. The house was dark. She had expected that. She tied Pearl at the post beside the front porch. The post was loose, she noted. Would need attention, and she used the key she had kept on her person since her father's death, despite Nicholas's occasional mild puzzlement about why she felt the need to carry it. The front room smelled of dust and closed windows and the faint memory of her father's pipe tobacco, which she had hated when she was young, and which now hit her somewhere so deep in her chest that she had to stop up for a moment in the dark and simply stand with it. She felt along the mantelpiece until she found the candle stub in the tinderbox. Light. Enough light. The furniture was sheeted, the fireplace was cold. A mouse had been at the corner of one curtain. She could see the evidence even by candlelight. Sophia set the candle on the mantelpiece and looked at the room. A woman with less clear eyes might have seen wreckage. Sophia Sinclair Thornton had been managing property, real property, not as a courtesy title but in actual daily practice for 5 years. She knew the difference between a problem and a cost. She knew the difference between something broken and something that simply required work. She sat down in her father's chair, the old reading chair with the cracked leather arm that he had refused to reupholster his entire adult life. She thought about Daniel. She would send word in the morning, not to Nicholas, but to Mrs. Pratt, who had a good heart and who understood. Sophia believed. Rather more than she permitted herself to show. She would make arrangements. There were arrangements to be made, many of them, and she had always been better at making arrangements than most people around her had given her credit for. She thought about the ring. She wondered if Nicholas was still holding it, or if he had put it in his pocket. She wondered what Catherine Voss had said to him after the room began breathing again. She discovered, sitting in her father's chair in the candlelit dark, that she was not crying. She had expected tears. She had spent months, in the privacy of her own mind, anticipating some version of this moment and the grief she expected to accompany it. But what she found instead was something quieter and in its own way more significant, a steadiness. A bedrock quality. The feeling of a woman who has finally stopped bracing for an impact and discovered that the thing she feared has already happened, and she is still here, still herself, still absolutely intact. Outside, Pearl moved against the post. The spring night carried the sound of peepers from somewhere down toward the creek. Sophia Sinclair, she was already in her own mind, shedding the second name, leaned back in her father's chair. She had work to do in the morning. She had a great deal of work to do. And for the first time in 5 years it would all be hers. She did not sleep much. By the time the sky began to pale in the east, she had already walked the lower field, noted where the drainage ditch had partially collapsed over the winter, assessed the state of the barn better than the house, structurally, which was something, and stood for a long while at the northeast corner of the property where the creek ran along the boundary line, listening to the water. She had learned to listen to land from her father, who had learned it from his father before him. It was not the mystical thing some people made it into. It was simply paying attention with patience, noticing what was actually there rather than what you wished was there or feared was there. The land at Sinclair Farm, she was already calling it that in her mind, resurrecting the name her father had used, was tired but not ruined. The soil in the south field, even from the surface, had the dark richness of ground that had been rested and was ready to work again. The creek was running clear and full with the spring snowmelt. The fence lines needed significant repair on the eastern edge, but the posts were sound. It was the work of a season, maybe 2, to bring this back to something productive. She knew how to do it. That was the thing, she thought, that Nicholas had perhaps never fully understood, that she knew how to do it. Not theoretically. Not in the educated woman's drawing room discussion way of knowing. She had watched her father work this land. She had walked these fields at his side and listened to him think out loud about soil and weather and timing and the thousand small decisions that built into, over years, a living operation. She had for 5 years been the primary functional manager of Thornton Estates' household and a significant contributor to its agricultural decisions, though Nicholas had never formally acknowledged this. Partly because to acknowledge it would have required him to see it, and seeing it would have complicated the story, he preferred to tell himself about what a marriage was. The sun came fully up. A cardinal landed in the fence line and looked at her with its small, fierce face before taking off again. "All right," she said again, to herself, to the cardinal, to the brightening morning. She went back inside to write the letter to Mrs. Pratt. She had $3 and some change in the small purse she'd carried to the celebration. She had the clothes she was wearing. She had Pearl, who was her own in a way she was fairly certain she could defend legally if it came to that, having purchased the horse with money from her own father's estate before the full accounting had been transferred. She had the key to this house, and the knowledge of this land and the capacity, developed over years of quiet necessity, to make order from disorder and sense from confusion. She thought, somewhat more than enough. The letter to Mrs. Pratt she wrote with the old pen she found in her father's desk, and the ink that had dried somewhat but still moved with patience across the page. She kept it brief and factual. She explained that she would be staying at Sinclair Farm for the immediate future, and that she would like Mrs. Pratt to ensure Daniel was well, and to send word to her, through the Hargrove cousins in Fredericksburg, who could be trusted to carry messages without embellishment. She did not explain, she did not ask for sympathy or understanding. She folded the letter and addressed it, and placed it on the mantelpiece to be carried when she had the means to carry it. Then she went out to see about the drainage ditch. The first person to arrive was Thomas Caldwell's wife, Eleanor, who appeared at the Sinclair farm gate on horseback 2 days after the anniversary celebration, with an expression on her face that mixed genuine concern with the barely suppressed energy of a woman who had been waiting for permission to come. Sophia was in the yard, sleeves rolled above her elbows, working on the post that had been loose since she arrived. She looked up at Eleanor's approach and felt the specific complicated feeling of being seen before she was ready. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," Eleanor said before she had even dismounted. "I wasn't planning to." Eleanor swung down from the saddle with the ease of a woman who had been riding since childhood, which she had. She tied her horse and came through the gate and looked at the loose post in Sophia's hands, and at the rolled sleeves, and at the face that had certainly seen better nights for sleeping, and her expression went from complicated to simply human. "Thomas said Nicholas is." She stopped, started again. "He's not handling it well." "That's not my concern at the moment." Sophia tested the post. Still not right. She needed better tools than the ones she'd found in the barn, a proper mallet or a maul. "How is he handling it specifically?" Eleanor paused. "He's been saying you'll come back." Sophia looked at the post. She thought about that expression across the ballroom, the expectation, the absolute bedrock certainty that she would absorb and accommodate and continue. She thought about 5 years of absorbing and accommodating and continuing, and the way that, over time, certainty in another person could calcify from trust into something more like entitlement, until they were no longer certain, because they knew you, but certain because they had simply stopped imagining any other possibility. "He would think that," she said, Sophia. Eleanor's voice was careful. "What are you going to do?" Sophia set the post down and looked at her friend, because Eleanor was her friend, had been for 3 years, was one of perhaps 4 women in the county whose company she found genuinely nourishing rather than merely manageable. She looked at her and she thought about the real answer to that question, which was long and complicated and rooted in plans that were still forming, still finding their shape, still discovering what they could become. "I'm going to fix the drainage ditch in the lower field," she said. "And after that, I'm going to figure out what the soil conditions are in the south pasture. And after that, I'm going to write some letters." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her face relaxed, not into relief exactly, but into something like recognition. The recognition of a woman who has seen another woman finally decide. "What do you need?" Eleanor said. Sophia looked at the post. "A proper maul." and someone who knows about soil drainage in this part of the county. And possibly someone to talk to in the evenings who isn't a mouse. Eleanor almost smiled. I know a man who does drainage work. He's honest and he's not expensive. As for the evenings, she glanced around the yard, at the house behind Sophia, at the fields and the fence lines, and the particular quality of morning light on a piece of Virginia land that was finally being asked to be itself again. I can come Tuesday, Sophia said. Good. She picked up the post. She went back to work. And Thornton Estate, 12 miles south on a road Sophia Sinclair did not look back toward, was already beginning to discover what it meant to operate without the woman it had taken for granted. Eleanor came on Tuesday as she'd promised, and she brought the drainage man. His name was Silas Webb, and he was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the kind of hands that told you everything about a man's life before he opened his mouth. He walked the lower field with Sophia for 20 minutes without speaking, stopping at to crouch, dent, and press his fingers into the earth near the collapsed section of the ditch, reading the ground the way some men read a ledger. 3 days of work, he finally said. Maybe 4 if the clay layer's deeper than it looks. You've got a natural grade running southeast. Somebody cut this ditch wrong to begin with, fighting the slope instead of using it. Sophia crouched beside him and looked where he was pointing. My father had it put in 30 years ago. He trusted the man he hired. Trusting the wrong man costs you. Silas stood, brushing dirt from his knee. I can have it done right this time. Water'll drain clean to the creek instead of backing up into your south field. What will it cost? He named a figure. It was fair she knew enough to know that, and she told him so, and they shook hands over it, the way people in the county shook hands when they meant what they said. And Silas Webb went back to his wagon to get his tools, while Sophia stood in the lower field and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem being converted, through the simple application of honest work, into a solution. Eleanor was waiting at the fence line. She had watched the whole exchange with the expression of a woman running quiet calculations. You negotiated him down. I didn't negotiate him at all. I accepted what was fair. Sophia climbed through the fence rails. There's a difference. Nicholas always to negotiate down, Eleanor said. Even when what he's offered is already reasonable. Thomas says it's because he thinks that's what power looks like. Sophia didn't answer that directly. She started walking back toward the house, and Eleanor fell into step beside her. And for a while neither of them said anything. Which was one of the things Sophia valued most about Eleanor Caldwell. The woman understood Spaslangd be companionable instead of uncomfortable. It was Eleanor who broke it. Eventually, he sent a letter. Sophia kept walking. When? It arrived at our house yesterday. Thomas didn't know whether to tell you. Eleanor paused. He told me instead. What did it say? That you were, and I'm telling you his words. Not my interpretation that you were acting out of emotion and that once you'd had sufficient time to compose yourself, he hoped you would return to discuss matters rationally. Sophia stopped walking. She turned that sentence over in her mind, examining it the way you examine something for structural damage, looking for the places where it revealed more than it intended to. Acting out of emotion. Compose yourself. Return to discuss matters rationally. He thinks I was hysterical, she said. He thinks you were hurt, Eleanor said carefully. Which I believe he considers the same thing. And what does he intend to discuss rationally when I return? The question came out quieter than she expected, and quieter was more dangerous than loud, and she suspected Eleanor understood that. The arrangement with Miss Voss? The terms under which I continue to manage his household while he... Sophia, she started walking again. He used that word. Compose. As if I were a piece of music that had gotten away from its structure. As if the only possible explanation for what I did was that I temporarily lost my reason, and as soon as I find it again, I'll recognize how much I need to come back. She reached the porch steps and stopped there, one hand on the rail. I was composed, Eleanor. I have never been more composed in my life than I was in that ballroom. Eleanor stood at the base of the steps and looked up at her. And there was something in her expression that was not quite pity and not quite admiration and lived. Uncomfortably. Somewhere between both. I know, she said, I was there. The letter from Mrs. Pratt came 4 days after Sophia sent hers, carried by one of the Hargrove cousins' stable hands as she'd arranged. It was written in Mrs. Pratt's careful, slightly formal hand, the penmanship of a woman who had learned to write as an adult and treated each letter with the seriousness of something hard-won. Daniel was well. He was asking for his mother with the cheerful persistence of a 4-year-old, who had not yet been given an explanation he could understand. But he was eating and sleeping, and had made no unusual distress beyond the ordinary asking. Mrs. Pratt had told him that his mother was staying at her family's old house for a little while, which was true, and Daniel had accepted this with the practical flexibility of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of impermanence. The second paragraph was more careful. Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Pratt wrote, had not returned home on the night of the celebration until well past 2 in the morning, and when he had not been alone, and she, Mrs. Pratt felt it her duty to communicate this fact, though she communicated it with considerable discomfort and without judgment of anyone present. The third paragraph was shortest. Mr. Thornton had asked this morning that the blue sitting room be rearranged. The blue sitting room was Sophia. She had arranged it herself 3 years ago, with furniture she had selected and positioned according to her own preferences, and it was the one room in Thornton Estate that was entirely and specifically hers. She read that paragraph twice. She folded the letter and put it in her father's desk drawer, in the back, under the old surveying maps of the Sinclair property, and she went outside and spent the next 2 hours helping Silas Webb move displaced clay from the drainage ditch by hand, because the physical work of it was the only thing that kept the specific quality of her anger from finding an outlet that she would later regret. Silas, for his part, did not ask questions and did not comment on the fact that she was working harder than the situation strictly required, which confirmed her initial assessment that he was a man of good sense. By the end of the second week, Sophia had developed a routine. She rose before full light and walked the property. Not because she needed to. She had learned most of what she needed to know in the first few days, but because the walking itself was useful. Because each morning the land showed her something new, some detail she'd missed, or some change the weather had made, and because she had come to understand that the discipline of looking was its own kind of work. After the walk, she wrote letters, mostly to her solicitor in Charlottesville, a man named Andrew Fitch, whom she had met twice in the context of her father's estate, and who had struck her as precise without being cold, which was a combination she valued. To a seed merchant in Richmond, whose name she'd found in her father's old account books. To the Hargrove cousin who ran a small grain operation, and who had, at various dinner parties over the past 3 years, tried more than once to talk to her about agricultural methods while Nicholas redirected the conversation toward topics he found more interesting. The cousin's name was Robert Hargrove, and he wrote back within a week with 3 pages of detailed information about soil preparation for late-season planting, and a postscript that said, simply, about time someone was paying attention to that land. Your father would be glad. She read the postscript standing at her father's desk in the morning light and felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, and lived, like most of the things she was feeling these days, in the complicated territory between. She wrote Robert Hargrove back and asked if he knew anyone who needed seasonal work. He sent her 2 names within the week. The talk had started, of course. She had known it, had factored it into her thinking in those early days at Sinclair Farm, the way you factor weather into planting decisions, as a condition rather than a surprise. Virginia in 9818 was not a place that permitted a woman to return the wedding Landowner at her own anniversary celebration and subsequently establish herself on an independent property without generating considerable volume of social commentary. The commentary arrived in various forms. There was the well-meaning variety, carried by women she liked, who stopped by under the auspices of checking on her welfare and departed. She knew, with careful observations that would be shared at dinner tables across the county. She received them without resentment. They were not bad women. They were women operating within the conventions of their world, and she had been one of them not very long ago. There was the more pointed variety which reached her second hand. That she was foolish, that she had thrown away security over pride, that a man of Nicholas Thornton's position was entitled to his diversions, and a wife of sense understood this, and whatever she'd seen that night could have been managed with greater discretion and less theater if she'd had the wisdom to try. That one stung, she admitted to herself, not because it was right, but because she had heard versions of it inside her own head for 4 months before the anniversary celebration, the voice of accommodation, The voice that catalogued the costs of disruption and weighed them against the costs of endurance, and she had not yet entirely quieted that voice. She suspected she never would entirely. She wasn't sure she wanted to. A woman who felt no pull toward the easier path was a woman who had never understood what she was choosing. But she had chosen, and she went on choosing it every morning when she rose before the light and walked the land that was hers. It was on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the anniversary celebration, that she first saw the depth of what she was dealing with at Sinclair Farms Finances. Andrew Fitch, her solicitor, had ridden out from Charlottesville with a leather house satchel and the careful expression of a man about to deliver information that was worse than the recipient expected, but not as bad as it could have been, which was, she had learned, the professional solicitor's version of optimism. They sat at her father's table with the papers spread between them, and Fitch walked her through it methodically. The outstanding debt her father had carried against the property, the back taxes that had accumulated in the 2 years since his death while the estate sat in legal limbo, the questions about the mortgage arrangement with a Charlottesville bank that needed resolution before she could do anything formally with the land. When he finished, she looked at the papers for a long moment. "How long do I have," she said, "to address the tax situation? The county assessor has been patient, but patience has a practical limit. I'd say 4 months before you begin encountering formal pressure." "And the bank note?" "The bank's positions." Fitch paused, choosing words. "Mr. Harrington at the First Bank of Charlottesville is a practical man. He has no interest in acquiring farmland that requires management. If you can demonstrate that the property is actively being worked and that a repayment arrangement is viable, he'll negotiate." "What does he consider viable?" Fitch named a figure for the first quarterly payment. It was significantly more than $3 and change. Sophia looked at the papers. She thought about the Southfield soil, which was genuinely good. She thought about what Robert Hargrove had told her about late-season crops and what was realistic, Kanaka calendar, and the current state of the land. She thought about the 2 workers who had started last week, Thomas and a younger man named Caleb who was 17 and built like someone had assembled him specifically for heavy farm work. And she thought about what they could accomplish with the right direction. She thought about all of it for approximately 30 seconds. "Can you arrange a meeting with Mr. Harrington?" Fitch looked at her over his papers. "You want to negotiate with the bank yourself?" "I want to present my plan to the bank myself." There was a difference, and she said it simply without apology. "Can you arrange it?" He studied her for a moment with the expression of a man revising his assessment of a situation. "I can," he said. "I'll write to Harrington this week." She thought about Daniel constantly. This was the thing nobody talked about in the tidy social narrative of a wife who leaves the way the leaving is never clean, the way it has these jagged edges that catch on you at unexpected moments. She was building something real here, something that was hers, and she believed in the necessity of what she had done. And she missed her son with a physical ache that she found no efficient way to manage. She wrote to him through Mrs. Pratt. The letters were not sophisticated, he was 4, and the words she chose were simple and warm, and designed to do the specific work of reminding a 4-year-old that his mother was present in the world, even when she was not present in the room. She told him about Pearl and about the cardinal that appeared every morning on the fence post, and about the enormous earthworm that Silas Webb had unearthed from the drainage ditch, and which had, Sophia wrote solemnly, been the largest earthworm in the entire state of Virginia. She did not know if Mrs. Pratt read the letters to him, or had someone else read them or saved them for when he was older. She trusted Mrs. Pratt's judgment on this, as she had trusted it on most things related to Daniel's daily care for the past 4 years. What she did not trust was Nicholas's judgment, and that she knew was the stone at the center of everything. Nicholas arrived on a Friday morning, 4 weeks to the day after the anniversary celebration. She heard the horse on the road before she saw him. Pearl's ears went forward, the reliable early warning system of a well-attention-paying animal, and she was standing in the yard, reviewing a sketch of the fence line repair schedule she'd drawn up with Thomas when Nicholas Thornton came through the gate. He looked, she thought, like a man who had recently discovered that dignity required more active maintenance than he'd previously understood. He was well-dressed. He was always well-dressed. She'd give him that, but there was something around his eyes that was doing work. The work of a man who had not been sleeping simply. who had things circling in his mind that refused to land and settle. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her, at the sleeves again rolled past her elbows, at the fence repair sketch in her hands, at the evidence of work and sun and early mornings that had accumulated on her in 4 weeks. You look different. She waited. He tried to adjust. And I meant to say, you look well. I am well. She set the sketch down on the fence post. What do you need, Nicholas? The word landed on him. She watched it hit. He had been expecting something, not warmth, perhaps. He wasn't quite that oblivious. But something softer than this. Some version of the Sophia who had spent 5 years finding ways to make difficult moments more comfortable for the people in them. I need to talk to you, he said. You're talking. He took a breath. He looked at the fence line, the yard, the house, the garden beds that she had cleared and turned in the second week, and which were showing the first optimistic green of Thanksgiving. He looked at all of it like a man looking at a foreign country. I handled the situation badly, he said. Which situation? No, her voice was even. I want to know to which situation you're referring to. Because there have been several. A muscle moved in his jaw. The celebration. The way it appeared. The way it appeared. She looked at him steadily. She was on your arm, Nicholas. At our anniversary. In front of 60 people. That was not an appearance. I know. He looked at the ground. I know that, do you? She picked up the sketch again. Not because she needed it, but because her hands wanted something to do that was not what her hands wanted to do. Because your letter suggested that I needed to compose myself before we could have a rational conversation. Which implies that what happened was primarily about my emotional reaction rather than about what caused it. I wrote that wrong. He took 2 steps toward her. I wrote it badly. I was angry, Sophia. And I wrote it in anger. And it didn't say what I intended. What did you intend? He stopped. I intended to say that I want you to come home. The word hung in the spring air between them. Home. She thought about the blue sitting room rearranged. She thought about the particular expression on his face in the ballroom, not the later versions. Not the confused and alarmed versions after she'd placed the ring in his hand. But the first one. The one when their eyes met across the room and he stood there with Catherine Voss on his arm and looked at Sophia with the settled certainty of a man who believed she would absorb it. He blinked. Because you belong there. That's not a reason. She watched understanding try to form in his face and fail, and she felt the old exhaustion move through her. The exhaustion of a woman who has spent years explaining herself to a man who has never found it necessary to try very hard to understand. Why do you want me home, Nicholas? What specifically is missing? Everything. He said it with a conviction that she believed was genuine. And that made it, paradoxically, harder to hear rather than easier. The house doesn't. Daniel asks for you every day. He stopped, started again. I realized that you did more than I acknowledged. More than you saw, yes. More than I saw. She looked at him. She thought about 5 years of more than he saw, the accounts she balanced, the workers she managed, the social relationships she maintained, the 1,000 invisible decisions that held the structure of his life in place while he moved through it, focused on the parts he found interesting. She thought about how none of it had ever prompted him to see her differently until the moment stopped. Nothing has changed, she said. You asking me to return nothing you've said indicates that anything would be different. I ended things with Catherine. He said it quickly, like a man pulling a bandage. It's done. She's gone. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Because I left, she said. Not because of her. Because it was wrong. His voice had an edge of something that might have been genuine feeling. Because I looked at what I'd done, and I understood that it was wrong. And how long did it take you to understand that? He didn't answer. Because I've been here 4 weeks, she said. And before that, I knew about Miss Voss for 4 months. So I'm asking you how long, Nicholas. Because I think the answer tells us both something important about when you arrived at that understanding. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had rehearsed this conversation and discovered the actual version was nothing like the rehearsal. I can't give you a date, he said. No. She picked up her sketch. You can't. He stood there, hat in his. She had not noticed until now that he'd taken it off. which meant some part of him understood what kind of conversation this was, even if the rest of him was still catching up, and he looked at her with something that was genuine and that she believed, and that was not. She had to be honest with herself enough. So voice dropped. I know I failed you. I know. He stopped himself, started more carefully. I stopped looking at you. I looked past you. I looked at the estate, at the land, at the business, at everything that needed to be done, and I stopped looking at you, and I did not understand. I genuinely did not understand what you were doing or what you were holding together until you were gone, and the absence of it. He paused. It's like a hole in the floor, Sophia. Every time I go to step somewhere, there's something missing. She felt it. She felt it because she was not a woman without feeling, because she had loved this man, because she could hear underneath the inadequate words the genuine shape of something that might, in a different version of events, have been enough. But she had learned, in 4 weeks, something important, that her ability to feel his genuine pain and his genuine loss did not obligate her to become the solution to it. You loved having someone there, she said quietly. You loved the knowing. You loved that you could focus on the things you wanted to focus on because I was managing everything else. But that is not the same thing as loving me, Nicholas. Those are two different things, and you have been confusing them for a very long time. His jaw was tight. It might not be. She met his eyes. But he stood there for a long moment. The cardinal came back to the fence post and regarded them both briefly before departing. Pearl moved in the side yard. From somewhere in the lower field came the sound of Silas Webb and Thomas at work on the fence line repair. Will you come home, Nicholas said. The rehearsed version was gone. What was left was just the question. Sophia looked at her father's house. At the work she had done to it in 4 weeks, the repairs and the clearing and the beginning of something that was taking shape under her hands, slowly and with effort and entirely on her own terms. This is home, she said. He left without getting back on the road he had expected to get on, and she stood in the yard and watched him go. And then she went back to reviewing the fence repair schedule, because Thomas was waiting, and the work did not wait with him. But that evening, when the workers had gone, and Pearl was settled, and the spring dark had come down over the Sinclair property in that particular gradual way of Virginia evenings, Sophia sat in her father's chair with a cup of tea that had gone cold without her noticing, and she let herself feel the full weight of the afternoon. Not regret. She was clear about that. She ran a careful internal check and found the bedrock steadiness still in place. The clarity she had discovered in that first night in this house. And it was still there, unchanged. But she let herself feel the grief of it. The grief of a marriage that had been real, at the beginning, had contained something real, and had nonetheless arrived at the place it had arrived at, and could not simply reverse course because one of its participants had finally noticed the direction it was traveling. She thought about what Nicholas had said. Like a hole in the floor. Every time I go to step somewhere, there's something missing. She thought, yes, that is what it means when you take someone for granted long enough. You hollow out the floor and you don't notice you've done it until the structure fails. She thought about Daniel, and she thought about the solicitor's papers, and she thought about the bank meeting next week, and she thought about the Southfield soil, and whether the weather would hold for the planting she was planning, and whether Robert Hargrove's seed recommendation was the right one for this particular piece of land. She thought about all of it, and it was a great deal to think about, and it was entirely hers. And she went to bed before 9 o'clock and slept straight through until first light, without once dreaming about anything she had left behind. The bank meeting with Mr. Harrington happened on a Wednesday 8 days after Nicholas's visit. Andrew Fitch accompanied her, which was both practical and socially necessary. A woman negotiating a bank arrangement alone in 1818 was possible in the strict, technical sense, and inadvisable in almost every other sense. But Fitch had understood quickly that his role was to provide formal presence while Sophia did the actual work, and he had the professional intelligence to be comfortable with this arrangement. Harrington was a heavy-set man with careful eyes, and the measured manner of someone who had been evaluating risk his entire professional life. He greeted Sophia with the particular courtesy of a man who was not yet certain what category to put her in. Widow was the one he understood. Independent businesswoman was the one she was presenting. And the gap between those two required him to do some active mental work that she could see him doing. She laid out her plan without preamble. The south field would go into tobacco, the lower field into corn. Once the drainage work was completed, Silas Webb's work, which would be done by end of next week, and which she described in specific technical terms, including the corrected grade that would direct the water toward the creek rather than against the field. She had 2 men working the property currently. She would need 2 more by planting season. She had a contact for seed through Robert Hargrove, a credible name in the county, and she had spoken to a broker in Charlottesville about advance pricing on the tobacco crop, which she described accurately and without embellishment. She then described the payment arrangement she was proposing for the banknote, the specific quarterly amounts, the timeline. The collateral arrangement she believed was appropriate given the current state of the property versus its realistic production value over the next 2 growing seasons. Harrington listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at Fitch. Fitch said mildly, "Mrs. Thornton has been managing agricultural operations for several years." Harrington looked back at Sophia. He had the expression now of a man whose categories had been quietly rearranged. "Your timeline on the tobacco," he said. "What's your confidence level on the first harvest yield?" She gave him a number and the reasoning behind it, including the 2 variables that could affect it and the contingency she had thought through for each. He asked 2 more questions. She answered both. Then he looked at his desk for a moment, and he looked back at her, and he said, "I'll accept the arrangement on the condition that we review after the first harvest and adjust accordingly if yield is significantly below projection." "Agreed," she said, "on the condition that significantly below is defined in writing before I sign anything." He almost smiled. "Mr. Fitch will draw up the terms." She shook his hand across the desk. His grip was firm, and he met her eyes, and she thought, there it is. The moment when a man stops calculating whether to take EQ seriously and simply does. It took, she reflected, riding back toward Sinclair Farm with the afternoon sun on the road and Fitch riding companionably at her side. It took most men entirely too long to arrive at that moment. But when they did arrive, they tended to stay. The news from Thornton Estate came in pieces. The first piece arrived through Eleanor, who heard it from Thomas, who heard it from the Caldwell's accountant, who had been asked to look at Thornton's books. The quarterly accounts were significantly behind. 3 creditors had sent formal notices in the past month. A payment to a Richmond supplier that Sophia had always managed personally had been missed entirely, and the supplier had suspended deliveries. The second piece came from Mrs. Pratt's next letter, which arrived tucked inside a letter from Daniel. 4-year-old Daniel had apparently dictated a message that Mrs. Pratt had transcribed faithfully, consisting primarily of news about a dog that had wandered onto the property and some complex feelings about whether the dog should be allowed to sleep inside. But underneath Daniel's dictated news was a careful postscript from Mrs. Pratt. 2 of the household workers had given notice. One was leaving for an offer from a neighboring estate. The other had given no formal reason, but Mrs. Pratt's carefully neutral phrasing suggested that the current atmosphere at Thornton Estate was not one that people with options were choosing to stay in. The third piece was the one that came from a direction she hadn't expected. Robert Hargrove arrived at Sinclair Farm on a Tuesday afternoon, hitching his horse at the now solid fence the post she'd fully repaired in the first week with the slightly too casual air of a man who has something specific to say and hasn't quite decided how to say it. "I heard something," he said, after she'd given him coffee and they'd gone through the agricultural business he'd ostensibly come to discuss. "About the Thornton tobacco contract." She waited. "With the Mason brothers, 18 acres committed." Robert turned his coffee cup in his hands. "There was an offer. Good price early in the season. Whoever handles Thornton's accounts let it pass. When?" 3 weeks. He looked at her. "You knew about the Mason brothers arrangement." "I managed it for the past 2 seasons." She kept her voice level. "When did Nicholas contract someone new to handle accounts?" "Far as I can tell, he hasn't. Far as I can tell, he's been handling it himself." Sophia set down her own cup. Nicholas Thornton was an excellent landowner in the ways that had come to him through inheritance and observation. He understood land. He understood horses. He understood the broad strokes of a farming operation and the social relationships that supported a business of his kind. He was not and had never been precise about accounts. He was not systematic about the thousand small timing decisions that the difference between a profitable season and a difficult one frequently rested on. He had known this. She had known he knew this. She had been the precision. She had been the timing. She had managed it the way you manage something that would otherwise manage you. Quietly and constantly. And he had looked past it so completely that he had apparently not registered, until she was gone, that it was happening at all. The Mason Brothers contract, she said. What's the consequence of missing that offer? Robert said the number. It was not catastrophic. It was, however, significantly bad, and it was entirely preventable. And it was the first in what she suspected would be a sequence if things continued as they were. She thought about what Nicholas had said, like a hole in the floor. She thought, yes, and you are only now finding out how many floors there were. She did not feel triumphant. That was something she examined carefully in herself and found genuinely absent. What she felt was something more complicated, the particular sadness of watching a thing you built, a thing you maintained for years with care and attention, begin to come apart in the hands of someone who had never understood the full nature of what they were holding. And underneath that, something else. Something she did not examine too closely yet, because it was too early. And the ground beneath her was still new and not yet solid enough to hold the full weight of what she might, eventually, allow herself to consider. She picked up her cup. Thank you for telling me, she said. Robert Hargrove looked at her with the eyes of a man who had just revised upward a significant number of his previous estimates. Your father, he said, always said you were the sharpest mind on any piece of land you stood on. She thought about her father. She thought about this land and this house, and the tobacco going into the south field next week, and Daniel's letter about the dog, and the bank agreement in Fitch's careful legal hand, and the fence post that was solid now where it had been loose. He was a biased source, she said. Sure, Robert agreed. Didn't make him wrong. The tobacco went into the south field on a Thursday, 3 days after Robert Hargrove's visit. And Sophia worked alongside Thomas and Caleb from first light until the afternoon heat made the pace unreasonable. And then she kept going another hour after that, because the calendar did not adjust itself for comfort. By the time she walked back to the house, her back carried the particular conversation that comes from a full day of field work, a language of muscle and bone that she had not spoken in years, and was now relearning with something that surprised her by feeling like satisfaction. Her hands were darkened to the wrist. Her dress was past saving in any formal sense. She thought, never in her adult life looked less like Mrs. Nicholas Thornton of Thornton Estate. And she had she thought, never in her adult life felt more entirely like herself. She was washing at the pump in the yard when Eleanor's horse came up the road at a pace that was one notch faster than social visiting required. Eleanor dismounted without tying the horse, which told Sophia the news was significant before Eleanor opened her mouth. Catherine Voss is gone. Not just from Nicholas. Gone from the county. Her father closed his Charlottesville office and moved the family back to Richmond. Sophia dried her hands on her apron. When? 5 days ago. Quietly. Eleanor's voice held the complex texture of someone delivering information they are not sure how the recipient will receive. Thomas heard it from the tobacco broker. Apparently there was some arrangement between Voss Sr. and Nicholas that fell apart when you left. The brokerage partnership. It was contingent on the families being connected. Sophia went still. She turned that over slowly, the way you turn a stone to see what lives underneath. Catherine Voss's father had been expanding into tobacco broker. Nicholas needed a reliable broker. She had known this, had been aware of the gap in their current arrangement since the previous summer when their long-standing broker had retired. The connection made a brutal kind of sense. Nicholas had not simply taken a mistress. He had taken a mistress whose father offered him a business advantage, and he had held that arrangement in place alongside his marriage with the same compartmentalized practicality he applied to every other aspect of estate management. Except that he had miscalculated. He had not accounted for what Sophia would do. He had, she understood now, factored her presence in as a constant, not because he was certain of her love, not even because he particularly thought about it, but because he had simply stopped imagining alternatives. He brought her to the celebration, Sophia said slowly, because Voss Sr. expected a public acknowledgement. Nicholas was delivering one. Eleanor looked at her. That's what Thomas thinks. And when I left, the acknowledgement became a liability. She thought about this. He lost the brokerage arrangement when the Voss family understood that the connection wasn't going to be formalized. And the mistress along with it. Eleanor's voice was careful. He got nothing from it, Sophia. Neither side. Sophia picked up the apron and folded it with the automatic precision of a woman whose hands always needed something to do when her mind was working hard. She had expected to feel something clarifying at this information. What she felt instead was more complicated, a cold, precise anger that had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with the specific nature of how she had been calculated. Not replaced. Not even truly chosen against. Simply factored like a line in a ledger into an arrangement that had nothing to do with her. He didn't even have the honesty of desire, she said. More to herself than to Eleanor. Eleanor heard it anyway. What do you mean? If he had simply wanted her, if it had been that kind of recklessness, passion, lost his judgment, I could have understood that. I wouldn't have accepted it, but I could have understood it. She set the folded apron on the porch rail. But this was strategy. He managed me and managed her and managed her father, and he believed he could manage all three pieces simultaneously without any of them understanding what they were part of. He underestimated you. He didn't estimate me at all. She looked at Eleanor. That's what I keep coming back to. He didn't underestimate me. He simply did not factor in the possibility that I had a limit. That I was a person with a limit. Eleanor stood at the porch step and looked at her friend with the eyes of a woman who has known another woman long enough to see the difference between what she's saying and what she's carrying. Eleanor asked. I'm angry, Sophia simply. I think I've been managing the anger very carefully for several weeks, and I may have just reached the edge of what careful management can hold. Good. Eleanor came up the porch steps and sat down in a chair being invited, which was exactly what a real friend did. Be angry, you've earned it. The letter from Nicholas arrived the following Monday. It was longer than the first one. More carefully written, she could tell from the evenness of the hand that he had drafted it more than once, which was not something Nicholas Thornton typically did with correspondence. He was a man who wrote as he spoke, directly, efficiently, with the assumption that the first version was adequate. This version was not the first he wrote about the estate. He did it obliquely. Not in the way of a man asking for help, but in the way of a man describing a reality he was still adjusting to the missed payment to the Richmond supplier, which he named directly, and the corrective steps he'd taken, which he also named. He had reached out to a cousin in Fredericksburg, who had agreed to review the accounts temporarily. The household was operating but reduced. 2 workers had left. He wrote about Daniel, a full paragraph, specific and unguarded in a way that none of the rest of the letter was. Daniel had named the wandering dog Barnaby and had expressed with considerable 4-year-old conviction that Barnaby's continued outdoor residency was a moral failure on the household's part. Nicholas had apparently relented. Barnaby was sleeping in the kitchen. She read this paragraph twice. Then he wrote, I have been thinking about what you said. That I loved having someone there. That I confused the knowing with the loving. I have been thinking about it because I believe you were right, and I find being right about something that's more uncomfortable than I expected. And then I am not writing to ask you to return. I want you to know that. I'm writing because I think you should know the truth of what happened with Voss, and because you deserve to have the information rather than hear it through Eleanor Caldwell's husband. She set the letter down. He knew she had already heard it through Eleanor. He knew, had always known, was acute enough about social networks to know exactly how information moved in this county. He was writing this letter not to inform her but to demonstrate something. To show her that he was choosing transparency over the management of appearances, which was, for Nicholas Thornton, not a small choice. She did not write back. Not yet. She put the letter in the desk drawer with the others and went out to check on the tobacco. 3 weeks after planting, the South Field was doing what good soil does when it finally gets the attention it deserves, coming alive. The seedlings were even and strong, and Sophia walked the rows on a Sunday morning with Robert Hargrove, who had stopped by under the ostensible reason of checking on the seed stock and the actual reason of seeing how it was going. And he walked beside her with his hands in his pockets and an expression of professional assessment that gradually softened into something closer to pleasure. Your father would have loved this, he said. My father would have found 3 things to worry about. Sure, that's how you know someone cares about a piece of land. Robert stopped at the end of a row and looked back at the full length of the field. You've done in 6 weeks what most people take a full season to accomplish. I had good advice and better workers. She meant it. Thomas and Caleb had become, in the weeks of working alongside her, something more than hired hands. They had become people who cared about the outcome, which was a different and more valuable thing. Word's getting around, Robert said. About Sinclair Farm. What you're doing here, she looked at him. What kind of word? The good kind. He glanced sideways at her, with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man about to say something he isn't sure will land well. There are 3 men in this county I know of who've asked about your tobacco, and the crop isn't even halfway to harvest. They're asking because of who's growing it. She absorbed this. The particular quality of it, not charity. Not sympathy. Not social support for a woman in a difficult situation. But commercial interest based on the assessment of the operation itself hit somewhere she hadn't expected. Tell them I'll talk to them in August, she said. After the first assessment, Robert smiled, and she had the feeling he'd been hoping she would say something like that. It was on a Wednesday, at the beginning of her 7th week at Sinclair Farm, that the first genuinely serious problem arrived. It arrived in the form of a man named Gerald Marsh. She had seen his name in her father's old papers. He was a creditor, had loaned James Sinclair $200 against the property 8 years ago. A private arrangement that her father's papers documented, but that had not appeared in the formal accounting Fitch had reviewed. She had not known this debt existed. Neither, apparently, had Fitch, because it had been arranged informally, and the paperwork had been held by Marsh, rather than filed in any official capacity. Marsh arrived at the gate on a Wednesday morning with a copy of the loan document and an expression that was not hostile precisely, but that had the watchful quality of a man assessing how much resistance he was likely to encounter. He was 50, well-dressed, the kind of man who moved through county business with the confidence of someone who had been making arrangements for long enough to know how they usually concluded. Mrs. Thornton. He held out the document. She took it and read it. All of it, which took several minutes, and she did not rush the reading because Marsh could wait. The debt was real. The terms were unfavorable in the specific way that private arrangements between unequal parties tend to be unfavorable. Her father had signed something that gave Marsh significant latitude on the repayment timeline, meaning he could call the debt due with relatively short notice, and she would have limited legal recourse. How much notice, she said, still looking at the document. The arrangement specifies 30 days. Marsh said it without particular pleasure, which she noted. He was not enjoying this. He was conducting business. I understand this is not ideal timing. Why now? She handed the document back. This debt has been sitting for 8 years. I have some business matters of my own that require consolidation. He met her eyes without flinching. It's not personal, Mrs. Thornton. It never is. She looked at him steadily. What's the total with interest accumulated? He named the figure. It was significantly more than $200. The interest arrangement, she noted from the document, had been compounding in a way that her father had probably not fully understood when he signed. I need to speak with my solicitor, she said, of course. And I need you to understand something. She kept her voice even and her eyes on his face. Whatever the legal situation, I am not a woman who can be rushed into a disadvantageous arrangement. If you call this note in 30 days, you will get what I can give you in 30 days, which is not the full amount. If you give me until the first harvest August, you will get the full amount plus an additional sum as a courtesy for the patience. 60 days, he said. 75, she said. August is 75 days, and I want it in writing. He studied her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalculating. You drive a harder bargain than your father did, he said. It was not quite a compliment and not quite a criticism. My father was a kind man, she said, kind, but not at the expense of this land. Marsh took 60 seconds to decide. She watched the decision happen in real time. Watched him move through his assessment of her, the rolled sleeves, the field behind her, the tobacco in the ground, the workers visible in the distance, the entire accumulated evidence of a woman who had been working this property with intention and competence. She watched him conclude that she was not, in fact, the easiest path available. 75 days, he said. In writing, she shook his hand. When he was gone, she went inside and sat down and let her hands shake for exactly as long as they needed to, which was about 90 seconds. And then she wrote a letter to Andrew Fitch that she sent by the fastest route available. Fitch arrived the next morning and confirmed what she had read in the document. The debt was legitimate. The terms were as unfavorable as they appeared. And Marsh had done nothing illegal. He had simply been patient, in the particular patient way of a man who holds a private debt and waits for the most advantageous moment to call it. Can you get out from under it by August? Fitch asked. I have to. She had already been doing the math in her head for 16 hours. The tobacco is good, Robert says. If the weather holds and the pricing I was quoted in March is anywhere close to accurate, the first harvest should cover Marsh and the bank's first quarterly payment with something left. And if it doesn't? She looked at Fitch across the table. He was not trying to frighten her. He was a precise man asking a precise question, which was exactly what was paying him to do. Then I sell 2 acres on the western boundary, and I use that to cover Marsh, and I approach the bank about adjusting the quarterly schedule. And I plant the following season more aggressively, because I'll have a full year's knowledge of what this soil can do. She said it without hesitation, because she had already thought it through. There are 3 paths out of this position, Fitch. I've mapped all of them. The one I'm on is the most direct, but I haven't staked everything on it. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man who had arrived this morning, expecting to help a woman manage a crisis and was now recognizing that the management was already substantially underway. Your husband's solicitor contacted me last week, he said carefully. She went very still. About what? A potential arrangement regarding Sinclair Farm. Fitch kept his voice neutral. Nicholas Thornton is proposing to pay off the outstanding debts against this property, the banknote, and now presumably the Marsh debt in exchange for a formal legal claim on the farm itself. The room was quiet. She heard the workers in the distance. She heard Pearl moving in the yard. She heard the particular quality of silence that descends when something that has been moving fast comes to an abrupt stop. He wants to buy this property, she said. He wants to bring it under the Thornton Holdings. The arrangement would be structured so that you retained use of it. But he would own it. Her voice was still level. She was working very hard to keep it that way. He would own the debt and therefore the property. And I would remain here how, exactly? As a tenant? As his wife managing his farm? Fitch was quiet. He doesn't even understand that he's done it, she said, more to herself. He thinks he's helping. He thinks he's solving the problem. She stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the south field. The tobacco. The workers. The fence line that was solid now where it had been failing. He thinks I want to be rescued. What would you like me to communicate to his solicitor? She turned from the window. Flat and final. Tell him the property is not available and will not be available, and that any further inquiries in this direction will not receive a response. Fitch wrote it down. He did not argue, which confirmed for her that she had chosen a good solicitor. One more thing, she said. When you write to Harrington at the bank, I want to disclose the Marsh debt formally and adjust our repayment projection accordingly. I want everything visible. I want there to be no version of this situation where someone can claim they were surprised. You're building a paper record, Fitch said. I'm building a business, she said. The paper record is part of the business. She rode out to see Daniel that Sunday. She had arranged it through Mrs. Pratt, a Sunday visit midday, in the garden that ran along the east side of Thornton Estate, where Daniel spent most of his outdoor time, and where the encounter could be managed without requiring her to enter the house itself. She did not want to be inside Thornton Estate. She was not ready for that, and she was clear-eyed enough about herself to recognize when she was not ready for a thing. Nicholas was not present when she arrived. She did not know if this was his choice or Mrs. Pratt's arrangement or some combination of both, and she found that she was grateful without being willing to examine too closely what exactly she was grateful for. Daniel ran across the garden the moment he saw her coming through the gate, and he hit her at approximately knee height with the full-body commitment that only 4-year-olds and large dogs can manage. And she caught him and pulled him up and held him with a completeness that she had been carefully not thinking of for 7 weeks, because the thinking was too large for what her days required her to hold. He smelled like grass and something that might have been Barnaby. Barnaby is inside, he told her with the gravity of a child reporting significant news. He's not supposed to be, but he is. I've heard about Barnaby. She set him down and crouched to his level, taking his face in her hands, this face that was Nicholas's brow and her own eyes and something that was entirely its own. Are you all right, my love? I want you to come home, he said. Simply, directly, in the way of a child, yet learned that some truths are complicated to say aloud. She breathed through it. I know. When are you coming home? I don't know yet. She kept her voice steady. But I am coming to see you, and I will keep coming to see you. Do you understand? He considered this with the focused seriousness he brought to most things. Can Barnaby come see you too? Barnaby can absolutely come see me, she kissed his forehead. Tell me everything about Barnaby. He talked for 40 minutes about Barnaby, and about a frog he had found near the creek, and about a dispute with the boy from the neighboring property over something involving a stick that had been, in Daniel's telling, a matter of considerable injustice. She listened to all of it with the wholeness of a woman who is being given something she has been missing. And she stored every detail of it in the same careful internal place where she kept the other things she did not allow herself to examine too directly. When she left, he waved from the gate until she was out of sight. She held herself together until she reached the main road, and then she let herself cry for exactly as long as the first quarter-mile required. And then she straightened her back and clicked her tongue at Pearl and drove the 12 miles home to Sinclair Farm without stopping. Nicholas was waiting at her gate when she arrived. Not inside the gate, he was on the road side of it, which she thought might have been deliberate, might have been him understanding something she hadn't given him credit for understanding. He stood with his horse at the fence, and he watched her drive up, and he had the look of a man who has been standing somewhere long enough to have reconsidered coming several times and stayed anyway. She set the brake and climbed down. I saw Daniel today, she said before he could speak. I know, Mrs. Pratt told me he's well. She looked at Nicholas directly. He asks about me every day, Mrs. Pratt says. You should know that I'm aware of that, and it is the hardest part of this. I want you to know I understand that. Something moved across his face that was unguarded and real. I know it is. They stood on opposite sides of the gate. She waited. I heard you turn down my offer, he said. It was a proposal to buy this property. It was an offer to remove your debts. With strings attached that would have made this land yours. She kept her voice even. You don't see it that way, I understand that. But this is my land, Nicholas. The debt is my problem to solve. I am solving it. What I needed from you was not intervention. He looked at the south field. The tobacco, visible from the gate, was 18 inches tall and holding strong. You did that, he said. It was not a question. The tone of it was something she hadn't heard from him before, not admiration exactly, and not condescension, but a kind of reckoning. The sound of a man adjusting an internal calculation that had been running on bad data for a long time. I did that, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then the estate is struggling, Sophia, I know. Not failing, but struggling. He seemed to choose the words carefully, which was itself notable. I hired a man to handle the accounts. He's competent, but he doesn't know the property. He doesn't know the relationships, the supplier in Richmond, the arrangement with the Mason brothers. There are things that aren't written down anywhere because you kept them in your head. Write them down, she said. He looked at her. Whatever is in your head about how the estate runs, write it down. She said it without cruelty, but without softening. That's the practical answer. I can't carry Thornton Estate in my head anymore, Nicholas. It isn't mine to carry. He absorbed this. She watched it land. Watched him work through the specific meaning of it. Not the emotional meaning, but the operational meaning. The real-world implication of a thing he had treated as permanent being revealed as having been, all along, a choice she made. Is it too late, he said. She looked at him across the gate. At his face, which she had known for 5 years, and which was doing something she had not seen it do. Many times it was genuinely uncertain. Nicholas Thornton moved through the world as a man who knew where the floor was. Right now he was not entirely sure. Too late for what? She said. He took a breath. For any of it. The spring evening was settling in around them. The particular golden quality of Virginia light in the late afternoon. And Pearl moved quietly in the yard behind her. And somewhere in the south field, a bird was making its end-of-day noise. And Sophia Sinclair stood at a gate and looked at the man she had married and felt the full complicated weight of the question. I don't know yet, she said. It was the most honest answer she had. But I know that what was isn't what I would return to. Whatever answer exists, it would have to be something that hasn't existed yet. Nicholas stood with that for a long moment. Fair, he finally said quietly. That's fair. She unlatched her gate and led Pearl through and latched it behind her. She did not look back, but she noted as she walked toward the barn that he had not left yet, that he was still standing on the roadside of the fence, and that he was looking at the south field and its tobacco with the expression of a man trying very hard to understand something that should have been obvious to him much, much sooner. She did not find this satisfying. She found it sad in a way that lived in the same neighborhood as hope, which was itself the most disorienting thing she had felt since the night she walked out of the ballroom with the ring no longer on her finger. She put Pearl away and went inside to make her records for the day, and she wrote down every number and every decision and everything that had happened, because she had learned from building Thornton Estate what happened when you kept things only in your head. And she had learned, more recently, what happened when you finally stopped. The tobacco harvest came in on a Thursday in late August, 3 days ahead of Sophia's most optimistic projection. She was in the field when the first row came down, working alongside Thomas and Caleb, and 2 additional men she'd brought on in July. And the yield was not just good, it was the kind of good that made experienced farmers go quiet for a moment, before they let themselves react. The way people go quiet in the presence of something that exceeds what they'd allowed themselves to hope for. Robert Hargrove rode out that afternoon. He walked the cut rows without speaking, the same way he'd walked the field before planting, reading what was there with the patience of a man who trusted the land to tell him the truth if he listened correctly. Your father never pulled a crop like this from this field, he finally said. The drainage was wrong for 30 years. Sophia looked at the cut rows, at the weight of what had come out of ground that had been resting and waiting, and quietly gathering itself for exactly this. Good soil doesn't disappear. It waits. Robert looked at her sideways. She had the feeling he understood. She wasn't only talking about the field. The pricing held. Not just held, came in 4% above the March quote, because 3 buyers had been watching Sinclair Farm since August began, and 2 of them arrived at her gate within 48 hours of the harvest with offers in hand. Which was the kind of thing that happened when word had been moving through the county for months that something worth watching was growing out on the old Sinclair land. She sold to the better offer without apology, negotiated the delivery terms herself, and shook hands across her porch railing with a broker from Fredericksburg who told her, with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had arrived expecting a routine purchase, that he looked forward to doing business with her again next season. You'll want to come earlier next year, she said. The field across the creek will be in production by then. He said he would remember that. She believed him. Gerald Marsh received his payment in full on a Friday 71 days after he'd appeared at her gate with the loan document. She had asked Fitch to deliver it formally, with a receipt signed by both parties, and when Fitch returned that afternoon, he placed the signed receipt on her desk with a satisfaction that was professional but genuine. He asked about you, Fitch said. What did he ask? He asked how you'd done it. Fitch paused. I told him you had simply paid attention to what needed to be done and done it. He said he wished more of his debtors operated on that principle. She looked at the receipt. The number on it, the full amount. Interest included. Paid on time. Cleared completely was the most concrete thing she had felt in months. Not the most important, but the most concrete. The satisfaction of it was different from the satisfaction of the harvest, less warm and more structural, the feeling of a load-bearing wall proving its integrity. The bank's first quarterly payment, she said. We're on schedule? Delivered last week. Harrington's office confirmed receipt. Fitch sat down across from her desk, which was a departure from his usual habit of remaining standing, and the departure registered with her. He had something else to say. I had an interesting conversation with Harrington when I delivered it. She waited. Nicholas Thornton has approached the bank about restructuring some of his own arrangements. Fitch chose his words with the care of a man navigating between discretion and genuine concern for his client. Harrington didn't share specifics that would be inappropriate, but he indicated in general terms that Thornton Estate is carrying more strain than its public position suggests. Sophia looked at the receipt on her desk. She had known in the abstract that the estate was struggling. Nicholas had told her directly that evening at her gate. Robert Hargrove had told her about the Mason brothers' contract. Mrs. Pratt's letters, read carefully between their careful lines, painted a picture of a household operating with less ease than it had. But strain on a property the size of Thornton Estate was a different order of problem than strain on Sinclair Farm. What strained her could break her. What strained Nicholas was a discomfort. There was a difference in scale that she could not afford to forget. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I don't know what it means for your situation." Fitch stood. "I wanted you to have the information." After he left, she sat at her father's desk for a long while without writing anything. She thought about Nicholas at her gate, the evening light, the particular quality of his uncertainty. She thought about what she'd told him. Whatever answer exists, it would have to be something that hasn't existed yet. She had meant it when she said it. She still meant it. But she was beginning slowly and with great caution to allow herself to consider what that something might look like. The thought was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. A woman who has built something with her own hands, on her own terms. From the ground up, that woman had to be careful about the particular temptation of returning to what was familiar, simply because familiar had become, through the revision of suffering, more appealing than it actually was. She closed the account ledger. She went out to check on the field across the creek. Daniel's Sunday visits had become the fixed point of her week around which everything else organized itself. He was growing with the rapid, slightly alarming pace of children in their 5th year, and each Sunday he arrived with new information about the world that he needed to convey immediately and in full. He had strong opinions about Barnaby's dietary preferences. He had a complicated ongoing narrative about the frog near the creek, who had apparently survived the summer and achieved something close to legendary status. He had recently become interested in how tobacco grew, which Sophia suspected was because his father had been explaining the harvest to him, and he asked questions about it with a focused precision that she found both delightful and familiar. "Papa says it takes a long time," he told her on a Sunday in early September, the two of them sitting on the marsh steps while Pearl grazed in the yard. "It does," she said. "You have to be patient with it." "Papa says you were good at the tobacco." She was quiet for a moment. Nicholas was talking to their son about her. That was new, or if it had been happening before, Mrs. Pratt hadn't mentioned it, and Mrs. Pratt was meticulous about things worth mentioning. "I learned from your grandfather," she said carefully. "Was grandfather good at it?" "He was good at loving this land." "That's the most important part." Daniel considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "Is that why you came back here, because you love it?" She looked at her son and felt the particular weight of a question asked in innocence that carries more truth than the asker understands. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly why." He leaned against her shoulder. The easy, unconscious weight of a child who trusts the structure beneath him completely. And she put her arm around him and looked at the south field and thought about love that was also competence. Also attention. Also the daily choosing to show up and do the work that the thing required. She thought, "I have been doing that for this land. I did it for Thornton Estate for 5 years. The difference is that this land knows it. This land shows it back." She held Daniel until his nurse came to collect him, and then she stood at the gate and watched him go, and then she went inside and wrote in her ledger, and did not let herself think about what he had said for the rest of the evening. She was not entirely successful. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, and it was not from Nicholas. It was from Mrs. Pratt. In 9 months of correspondence, Mrs. Pratt had been careful, precise, and consistent in the nature of what she communicated news of Daniel, practical household information, the occasional carefully neutral observation that Sophia had learned to read the way you read weather signs, not at face value but for what they indicated about what was coming. Mrs. Pratt did not editorialize. She did not offer opinion. She wrote what was factual and left interpretation to the reader. This letter was different. It was not unprofessional. Mrs. Pratt was constitutionally incapable of unprofessional. But it was direct in a way that the previous letters had not been, and Sophia read it twice before she fully absorbed what was being communicated. Nicholas had dismissed the accountant, not for cause or not for the cause, Mrs. Pratt's careful language suggested. He had dismissed him. In the past 2 months, Nicholas had been managing the accounts himself, and the accountant had pushed back on 2 decisions in ways that Nicholas had found In Mrs. Pratt's precise phrasing difficult to accept constructively. Mrs. Pratt then described in careful sequential order 4 operational decisions Nicholas had made in the past 6 weeks. She described them without commentary. She didn't need to. Sophia read them and understood immediately that 2 were sound, 1 was risky in a way that might resolve itself, and 1 was the kind of decision a man makes when he is trying to prove something to himself and has allowed that motivation to override his judgment. The 4th decision was about the eastern acreage. Nicholas had committed it to a new crop arrangement, a different variety, higher risk, higher potential return without the soil assessment that the decision required. Sophia had been meaning to commission that assessment for the past 2 growing seasons and had not yet done it because the timing hadn't been right. The eastern acreage had particular drainage characteristics that made it tricky, and the new crop arrangement was exactly the kind of thing that those drainage characteristics could destroy if the season turned wet. If the season turned wet, she set the letter down. She looked out the window at her own south field. The cut rows waiting for their next season. The fence line that was solid. The drainage ditch that Silas Webb had corrected in the first weeks, and that had performed exactly as he'd promised through the entire growing season. She thought about the eastern acreage. She had walked those fields dozens of times. She knew exactly where the drainage problem was and exactly what would happen to that crop in a wet September, and September in Virginia had a history of exactly that. She sat with this for a long time. Then she wrote 2 letters. The first was to Mrs. Pratt, brief and factual, asking for confirmation of the specific planting details and timeline for the eastern acreage. The second was harder to write. She drafted it 3 times before she arrived at a version she would send. It was addressed to Nicholas, and it contained no softness and no judgment and no emotional content of any kind. It contained specific agricultural information, the drainage characteristics of the eastern acreage, the historical rainfall data for September that she had in her father's record, the particular variety risk profile given those 2 factors combined, and a clear, direct assessment of what she believed would happen if the current arrangement stood. At the bottom she wrote, "This is not a negotiation. I am not asking for anything in return. This is information that the land requires someone to have, and I have it, and I am giving it to you, because Daniel's future includes Thornton Estate whether I am there or not." She sent it by the fastest route available. Nicholas appeared at her gate 4 days later, not with the rehearsed manner of his earlier visits, not with the long pause at the gate while he assembled himself. He came up the road with the directness of a man who has made a decision and is moving toward it before he can reconsider. She was on the porch when he arrived, reviewing the plans for the creekside field, and she looked up and read his expression before he said anything. It was not the expression she had expected. "You were right," he said without preamble. "About the eastern acreage," she waited. "I had Silas Webb out yesterday. After your letter." He stopped at the gate. He did not open it. She noticed this, that he had adopted, over the course of his visits, the habit of staying on the roadside of her gate, unless invited, which was a small thing and also not a small thing. He showed me the drainage issue. He said it was a significant problem. He said someone should have addressed it 2 years ago. I had it on my list, she said. I never got to it. Because you were managing everything else. She did not answer that. I've stopped the eastern planting. He looked at her directly. I can absorb the contract penalty. It's better than the alternative. Yes, she said, it is. He stood there. She watched him work through whatever he had come to say. The way she had watched him work through things for 5 years, with the particular quality of a man who moves through most of the world with assurance and finds himself genuinely uncertain only in the moments that matter most. I've been writing things down, he said, like you told me. Everything that was in my head about how the estate operates, the relationships, the timings, the all of it. I've been writing it down. Good. It's taken 3 weeks. He looked slightly stunned by this, and she understood why. When you write down what you actually know, when you commit it to paper and look at its full shape, it is frequently larger than you understood it to be while it was simply living in your head. There's more of it than I realized. There always is. He was quiet for a moment. A farmhand crossed the yard behind her on his way to the barn, nodded briefly in her direction, went about his work without breaking stride. The ordinary commerce of a functioning operation, Sophia. Nicholas's voice had changed register lower, more careful. I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that I am asking it without any expectation of a particular answer. I have thought about how to say this for several weeks, and I don't have a better way than directly. She set down the field plans and looked at him. Would you consider coming to see the estate? He held her gaze. Not to return. Not as I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm asking if you would come and look at it, the way you look at land. With the eyes you use when you're assessing what a thing actually needs. He paused. There are decisions coming that I don't trust myself to make well without the information only you have. And I realize that I am asking you to do something that I gave you no reason to want to do for me. The directness of it hit her somewhere she hadn't been braced for. It was not a request for forgiveness. It was not a romantic appeal. It was a man asking, specifically and honestly, for her expertise. Acknowledging, specifically and honestly, that her expertise was real, and that it was something he needed and had not valued until he no longer had access to it. It was, she thought, perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said to her. Not yet, she said. The words came out more gently than she'd planned. I'm not ready to walk through that house yet. But, she stopped. The eastern acreage. I'll meet you there. On neutral ground, he looked at her. Saturday morning, she said. I'll bring my drainage assessment notes. You bring the new crop contract so I can see the full terms. Something moved in his face that was not Hope too careful for that, but was adjacent to it, in the way that a cleared field is adjacent to a harvest. Not the thing itself. The condition that the thing requires. Saturday, he said, thank you. She picked up her field plans. It's for the land, Nicholas. The land doesn't care about anything else. He accepted this. He turned his horse and started back down the road, and she watched him go and stood with the complicated weight of what had just been agreed to. Eleanor appeared from around the sides of the house with the studied nonchalance of a woman who had absolutely been listening from a position of reasonable deniability. I wasn't eavesdropping, Eleanor said. Of course not. I was simply standing near the house while you happened to have a conversation. Eleanor came to stand beside her at the fence. They watched the road together, empty now, Nicholas gone around the bend. You're going to help him, Eleanor said. Not quite a question. I'm going to help the land. Sophia looked at the south field. There's a difference, is there? Eleanor's voice was careful. After all of this, you still feel it, the land there? Sophia was quiet for a moment. I built things there for 5 years. You don't stop caring about what you built just because someone failed to notice you building it. She looked at Eleanor. That's not weakness. That's just what caring actually means. It doesn't turn off because it's inconvenient. Eleanor looked at her with the expression of a woman hearing something she knows is true and wishes she'd said herself. Be careful, Eleanor said quietly. I am always careful. Sophia turned back toward the house. I was careful when I married him. I was careful when I left. And I will be careful on Saturday. Careful doesn't always protect you from wanting things you've decided not to want. Sophia stopped with her hand on the porch rail. She stood there for a moment, her back to Eleanor, looking at her father's house, at the repaired porch, and the cleared yard, and the garden that had come in strong, and the windows that she'd had reglazed in July, with money she had earned with her own hands on her own land. It doesn't. She went inside. Saturday came with a high, clear sky and the dry air of early autumn, and Sophia arrived at the eastern boundary of Thornton Estate on horseback, with her drainage notes in her saddlebag, and the deliberate, contained composure of a woman who has decided exactly what she is doing and is not permitting herself to feel the full weight of the fact that she is doing it. Nicholas was already there. He had the crop contract in hand, and the expression of a man who had arrived early because arriving late would have been unbearable. They stood together at the edge of the field, and Sophia walked the boundary lines and showed him what she saw in the ground and explained the drainage behavior and named the exact points where intervention was needed. She spoke the way she spoke to Fitch, to Robert Hargrove, to Silas Webb, with precision and without softness, because what the land required was precision, and the softness would not serve it. Nicholas listened, not in the way of a man being patient while he waited to speak. He listened the way she had watched him listen to no one fully, with the attention that had always been there in him, but had never, in 5 years of marriage, been directed at her in this specific way. At one point she stopped mid-explanation because she had lost her place in the notes. He found it. He had been following along, had the document oriented correctly, Put his finger on the line she needed without her having to ask. She looked at his hand on the paper. She thought about the ballroom. She thought about the ring. She thought about her father's chair in the candlelit dark and the first morning's she walked this land alone, and the drainage ditch Silas Webb had corrected, and the tobacco in the south field and Daniel's weighed against her shoulder on a Sunday afternoon. She thought about all of it, and she looked at his hand on the paper, and she said, the intervention needs to happen before the autumn rains. You have perhaps 3 weeks. I'll have Webb out Monday, Nicholas said. Good, she closed the notes. That's everything I have. He held the contract in his hands and looked at it for a moment. This arrangement, he said. Today, is this something you would consider continuing? As a consulting arrangement? Formally. I would pay you, Sophia, for your knowledge of this land, for your assessment. No other expectation attached to it. She looked at him. It was perhaps the small, unexpected thing he had ever offered her. Not herself back, not the marriage restored. Her expertise named and compensated, treated as the real and valuable thing it had always been. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded once, accepting this completely. She rode home with the dry autumn air in her face, and the particular quality of a day that has changed something without quite finishing the changing. And she noted, with the careful precision she brought to everything, that she was not unhappy. She was not unhappy, and she was not certain, and she was not done deciding. And those 3 things, she thought, were exactly the right things to be. The consulting arrangement began without ceremony, which was exactly how Sophia wanted it. No formal document at first, that came later, at her insistence, because she had learned through 9 months of building Sinclair Farm that everything consequential needed to be written down. But in the beginning it was simply this. Twice a week. Sometimes 3 times when the autumn pressed its decisions hard against the calendar. She rode the 12 miles to Thornton Estate's eastern boundary, or its south fields, or the equipment barn where the winter preparation was underway, and she looked at what needed looking at, and said what needed saying, and rode home again. Nicholas paid her. The first payment arrived through Fitch, with a formality that was deliberate and respectful. The formality of a man who understood that the payment itself was a statement, that what she brought to this land had value that could be named and compensated, and was not simply the invisible labor of a wife, who was expected to contribute without accounting. She accepted it without comment. She put it in her ledger. She used it to hire a 3rd full-time worker at Sinclair Farm, a woman named Ruth who had been managing her own small garden plot with a precision that Sophia recognized immediately as the kind of competence that deserved a larger stage. Eleanor noticed. You hired a woman, she said, on a Tuesday visit, watching Ruth move through the garden beds with the focused efficiency of someone who understood exactly what each plant required. I hired the best person for the work. Sophia poured tea. She happened to be a woman. Does Ruth know about the consulting arrangement? Ruth knows I ride out twice a week and come back with paperwork. She hasn't asked for more detail than that. Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup. Thomas asked Nicholas about it at dinner last week. Sophia looked up, and Nicholas said. Eleanor paused, choosing how to say it. He said that Sophia understands this land better than anyone alive, and that he had spent 5 years benefiting from that without acknowledging it, and that he intended to correct the error as completely as she permitted him to. Sophia set down her cup. She absorbed that, held it up against the light, the way she held up anything she wasn't yet sure how to categorize. He said it in front of Thomas, she said. He said it in front of Thomas and Margaret Hargrove and the Caldwell cousins from Fredericksburg. Eleanor met her eyes. Dinner party. 8 people. The room was very quiet. Nicholas Thornton had said. In public. In front of witnesses who would carry it to every dinner table in the county within a fortnight, that his wife understood the land better than anyone alive, and that he had spent 5 years failing to acknowledge it. He had not said it to her. He had not said it in private where it would cost him nothing. He had said it where it would travel, where it would become part of the record that the county kept about who people were. He knows it'll get back to me, she said. He knows, Eleanor agreed. I think that was rather the point. The first frost came hard in the 3rd week of October, earlier than the almanac had projected, and it caught 2 of the neighboring farms with crops still in the field. It did not catch Sinclair Farm. Sophia had pulled everything in 5 days before. Reading the particular quality of the late afternoon light, and the behavior of the creek, and a coldness in the early mornings that the almanac didn't have language for, but that her father had taught her to recognize. It also did not catch Thornton's eastern acreage, because Silas Webb had completed the drainage correction in September, and Nicholas had moved the harvest up at Sophia's recommendation, a decision that had required him to hire additional labor on short notice and absorb that cost, which he had done without argument. The neighboring farmer who lost the most to the frost was a man named Garrett, who stopped Sophia on the road to Charlottesville 3 days after the freeze with an expression that mixed genuine distress with the specific irritation of a man who has just discovered that someone else avoided a problem he walked directly into. Garrett demanded. Not hostile. Webb did your drainage. Webb does my drainage too. He didn't tell me anything. Silas Webb does excellent drainage work, Sophia said evenly. He did not tell you because you didn't ask him to assess your harvest timing. You asked him to dig ditches. Garrett stared at her. The signs were there for anyone reading them. She kept her voice without edge. The light in the afternoons for the past 2 weeks. The creek level dropping faster than the rainfall accounted for. The behavior of the migrating birds, which moved through 10 days earlier than last year. She paused. Your almanac is a good general tool. It doesn't know your specific land. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Would you? He stopped. I'd pay for an assessment next spring for planting. Speak to Andrew Fitch, she said. He handles my consulting arrangements. She rode on toward Charlottesville, and she did not permit herself to smile until she was well around the bend, because she was a professional, and professionals did not gloat on the public road. But the smile, when it came, was the full unguarded kind that she had not been giving herself permission to feel for most of the year. She was building something, not just the farm, something larger than the farm, and it was entirely irreversibly hers. The twist came on a November morning, in a letter she had not expected from a direction she had not been watching. It was from a solicitor in Richmond, not Fitch, an unknown name, and it was addressed to Mrs. Sophia Thornton, and it concerned a property matter that she had not known was a matter at all. She read it standing at her father's desk because she had picked it up on her way through the room and hadn't bothered to sit down first, which she immediately regretted because the letter required sitting down. The Sinclair property, her property, the farm she had spent 10 months rebuilding from the ground up, had a second mortgage, not the Marsh debt which was paid, not the bank note which was current. A second mortgage, older than both, dating to a period 6 years before her father's death, held by a Richmond investment firm that had acquired it as part of a larger portfolio purchase from an original private lender and had apparently not gotten around to notifying the property's current occupant of their interest until now. The debt was substantial, substantially more than the Marsh debt. The interest terms were worse. She sat down, she read the letter again. Slowly, with the deliberate patience of a woman who knows that the second reading sometimes reveals what the first reading, in its shock, misses. It did not reveal anything better. The debt was real, the firm was legitimate, and the amount even accounting for a full harvest season, and the consulting income, and every other she could marshal, was beyond what she could address alone in any timeline that the letter's terms allowed. She sat at her father's desk for a long time. She had built this. She had done everything right. She had fixed the drainage and planted the tobacco and negotiated the bank and paid off Marsh and hired good people and done the work every day without asking anyone for rescue. And the ground had come up from under her anyway, in the form of a debt her father had contracted before she even knew this land was going to be hers. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the south field. She thought about Ruth in the garden beds, and Thomas on the fence line, and Caleb, who had learned more in 10 months than most men learned in 3 years, because he had been paying attention and she had been worth paying attention to. She thought about what it would mean to lose it. She put the letter in her pocket and she went to find Fitch. Fitch read the document with the expression of a man encountering something he should have found and didn't, and the professional discomfort of that discovery was visible on his face, in a way that Fitch, who was normally composed to the point of opacity, was not managing to conceal. I should have found this, he said. Yes. She kept her voice even. You should have. We'll discuss that. Right now I need to know if it's real. It's real. He set the document down. The firm is legitimate. The debt is properly recorded. It was filed in Richmond, not Charlottesville, which is why it didn't surface in my search. It was an unusual arrangement for a property of this size and location. My father trusted people he should not have trusted. It appears so. She looked at the document on his desk. Options. Fitch laid them out the way she had asked him to lay out options 100 times over the past tense clearly, sequentially, without softening the hard ones. Sell property. Negotiate a payment arrangement with the Richmond firm, which would require demonstrating liquidity she did not currently have. Find an investor willing to take a position in Sinclair Farm in exchange for partial ownership. She listened to all three. Or Fitch said, more carefully, there may be a party willing to address this debt without requiring ownership in return, given the consulting arrangement currently in place. She looked at him. I'm not suggesting anything, Fitch said. I'm identifying a theoretical option. You're identifying Nicholas. He didn't answer. She stood up and walked to the window and looked at the south field. The cut rows of what had been the best harvest this land had seen in 30 years. The fence lines that were solid. The garden where Ruth was working in the thin November light, with the unhurried competence of someone who understood exactly what each day required. She had sworn when she rode away from Thornton Estate on the night of the anniversary celebration that she would not be in a position where she needed him. She had built everything on that premise. She had made every decision through the lens of that premise, and she had succeeded, genuinely succeeded, by every measure she respected. And now her father's debt, not her failure, not her miscalculation, her father's old entanglement with a Richmond firm was threatening to undo it. She could feel the particular quality of the anger moving through her. Not at Fitch, not at the Richmond firm, at the sheer indiscriminate nature of circumstance, which did not care about how much you deserved what you had built. I need 3 days, she said, the firm's timeline. I need 3 days, she said again. And Fitch accepted this because he understood, had understood for 10 months. That when Sophia Sinclair said she needed time, it was because she was going to use it. She did not go to Nicholas, she wrote instead to Robert Hargrove. She laid the situation out at his kitchen table, with the Richmond letter between them and all the numbers named plainly, because Robert was the kind of man who needed plain numbers to do his best thinking, and she needed his best thinking right now. He read the letter. He looked at her numbers. He was quiet for longer than she expected. You know what this land is worth, he finally said. Not the debt value, the actual productive value, with the drainage corrected and the crop history you've established. The Richmond firm doesn't. He tapped the letter. They acquired this as part of a portfolio. They know the debt value. They don't know the operational value. She waited. What if you offered to buy the debt yourself? He looked at her steadily. Not negotiate the repayment terms. Purchase the debt outright from them at a discount, because to them it's a problem in a portfolio, not a prized asset, and retire it cleanly. Calculated. I don't have the capital for a lump sum purchase. Not alone. He held her gaze. But I've been watching what you've built here for 10 months, and I have capital sitting in conservative instruments that are returning less than your tobacco crop returned this season. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said everything, without drama or softness. I'm not offering charity, Sophia. I'm identifying an investment that I believe in. You would retain full ownership. I would take a return on the capital over 3 seasons. She looked at her father's oldest friend, because that was what Robert Hargrove was. She realized. Had always been. The man who had watched her father work this land for 40 years and had written her 3 pages of agricultural advice within a week of her arriving here, because he had been waiting. She understood now for someone to pay this land proper attention. You've been waiting to make this offer, she said. I've been waiting for you to need it, he said. There's a difference. If you'd needed it in month 2, I'd have offered it in month 2. You didn't need it. You don't entirely need it now, but the alternative options are worse, and I'd rather invest in certainty. She sat with this for a long moment. It was not rescue. She was clear about that, ran the check deliberately and found it genuine. It was a business arrangement between 2 people who had assessed each other's reliability and found the assessment favorable. It was the kind of arrangement that built counties and kept land in the hands of people who knew how to work it. I want it in writing, she said. Every term. Fitch will draft it. Wouldn't expect otherwise. Robert almost smiled. Fitch will draft it, I'll review it, and we'll both sign it before anything moves. She put her hand across the table. He shook it the same way. He shook every hand firmly with eye contact, with the weight of a man who meant what he did. She rode home lighter than she had ridden anywhere in a long time. She told Nicholas 3 days later, at the Eastern Acreage, where they had met twice a week through all of October. She told him about the Richmond debt, and about Robert Hargrove's arrangement, and about how it would be resolved. She told him clearly and completely and watched his face while she did. He listened without interrupting, which was new. The Nicholas of a year ago would have begun problem-solving before she finished the first sentence. This Nicholas listened until she was done. You handled it, he said. I handled it. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't come to me. No, she met his eyes. I didn't. Expected something from him in response to that defensiveness, or the particular male discomfort of a man who has not been needed or even relief. What she got was neither. Good, he said. She blinked. I mean that. His voice was steady. If you'd come to me with it, I would have helped you, and it would have changed what this is. What you built. He looked at the field. This needed to be yours. All of it. Even the hard parts. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man she had married and left, and spent a year learning to see clearly. And she thought, there it is. Thing I was waiting to see. Not the remorse came early and easy. Not the effort was visible and countable. This. The understanding that was not about him at all. I want to come back, she said. The words came out before she had finished deciding to say them, which told her something important about how finished the deciding actually was. Nicholas went very still. Not the way it was, she said immediately, clearly. That version of the marriage is gone, and I won't look for it. But something that hasn't existed yet, that we would build. She held his gaze. I keep Sinclair Farm. It remains mine in full in law and in practice. I manage it as a separate operation. My consulting work is formal and compensated for as long as I choose to do it. She paused. And you see me. Not the function I serve, not the structure I provide. Me, Nicholas was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and she had known this face for 6 years. It was the expression of a man who has been handed something he understood, fully and finally, that he nearly lost forever. Yes, he said, one word. No qualification, I'm not finished. She kept her voice level, even as something inside her was anything but. You speak about my work the way you spoke about it at the Caldwell's dinner party. Not as an accommodation, as fact. It is fact, and Daniel. Her voice changed slightly on her son's name, the involuntary change of a woman who has been holding something carefully for a very long time. Daniel grows up knowing what his mother built. He grows up knowing that the land his family holds exists, in part because of what I did here on this ground. That is not erased. That is not footnoted. I'll tell him myself, Nicholas said. Every year as he grows, I will tell him. She breathed. She had prepared herself for negotiation. She had prepared herself for resistance, for qualification, for the specific verbal maneuvering of a man who wants something and is trying to get it at the lowest possible cost. She had not prepared herself for simple, unguarded yes. It disarmed her more completely than any argument could have. I'm not bringing the ring back, she said. He reached into his coat pocket. He held it out on his open palm, the gold band, the one she had pressed into his hand in the ballroom 11 months ago. It caught the thin November light the same way it had caught the chandelier's light that night. I don't want you to, he said. If you come back, I want to put a new one on. Something we choose together. Something that means what we mean now, not what we thought we meant then. She looked at the ring in his palm. The old ring, the one that had started all of this. Keep, he said. He closed his hand around it. He nodded once. He sprang. She looked at Sinclair Farm's fence line, visible in the distance solid. Repaired hers. I want to see Sinclair Farm through the winter. I want to be there for the first planting of the new season. And then she paused. And then we'll see building something new looks like. He accepted this with the steadiness of a man who has learned, through the hardest kind of experience, that patience is not weakness, but the most demanding form of respect. She was the one who told Eleanor. On a Tuesday, with tea that stayed hot this time. In the kitchen of Sinclair Farm, where Ruth moved competently through the background, and Pearl moved in the yard, and the south field lay cut and resting under the November sky, waiting for what the next season would ask of it. Eleanor listened to the whole of it. She did not interrupt. When Sophia finished, Eleanor set down her cup and looked at her friend with the specific expression of a woman who has been watching another woman make her way through fire and has arrived, finally, at the other side. Are you sure? Eleanor asked. I'm sure of what I know and honest about what I don't. Sophia wrapped both hands around her cup. I know this land is mine. I know Sinclair Farm will keep running whether I sleep here or 12 miles south. I know that what I built this year is real and permanent and cannot be taken back from me, not by Nicholas, not by circumstance, not by anyone. She looked at Eleanor. And I know that the man standing at the fence last week is not the man who walked into the ballroom with Catherine Voss on his arm. I can see the difference. I've been seeing people clearly my whole life. That's not something I get wrong. Eleanor was quiet. I'm not forgiving the past, Sophia said. I'm not pretending it didn't happen. I'm choosing what comes next with my eyes open and my land under my feet and my name on the deed. She paused. That's different from what I did at 23. Yes, Eleanor said finally. It is entirely different. She reached across the table and covered Sophie's hand with her own. And they sat like that for a while. Two women in a kitchen in Virginia in the autumn of 1819. While outside the fields rested and the land did what land does in November, gathered itself, quietly and without ceremony, for what it intended to become. Spring came early to Sinclair Farm. The first planting went into the south field on a Wednesday in March, and Sophia was in the field from first light with Thomas and Caleb and Ruth, her sleeves rolled, her hands in the soil, reading what the ground told her the way her father had taught her and the year had confirmed. When she stood at the end of the south row at midday, she looked at what she had made of this land, the drainage that ran clean to the creek, the fence lines that were solid, the garden that had overwintered better than anyone expected, the second field across the creek that would come into full production this season for the first time. She stood there for a long time. And then she went inside and washed and changed her dress and told Ruth she would be back by evening. And she rode south on the familiar road. 12 miles she had traveled 100 times in the past year, and she did not hesitate at the gate. She was not arriving because she needed to. She was not arriving because the debt or the difficulty or the loneliness of a hard year had worn her down to the point where familiar was preferable to true. She was not arriving as the woman who had spent 5 years invisible in her own life. She arrived as Sophia Sinclair, owner of record of Sinclair Farm, manager of the most productive tobacco acreage in the county. A woman whose name had traveled through this county over the past 12 months, not as Nicholas Thornton's absent wife, but as a person of substance and skill, and the particular kind of integrity that comes from doing hard things correctly. Nicholas met her at the door. He looked at her the way she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to be looked at, not past her, not through her, not at the version of her that served a function. At Sophia Sinclair, standing on the porch of Thornton Estate with the March wind in her hair and the Southfield soil still on her boots and her eyes fully open. You came, I would. She met his gaze. When I say something, I mean it. That hasn't changed. No, the corner of his mouth moved. That was never something that needed to change. He stepped back and held the door, and she walked through it. Not as a woman returning to what she had left, as a woman choosing, with full knowledge and full agency, what she was walking toward. Behind her, 12 miles north, Sinclair Farm stood solid in the March morning, the fence line straight, the fields ready, the deed in Sophia Sinclair's name on file in Charlottesville where it would remain. Through every season that followed, exactly where she had placed it. A woman who knows the value of what she has built does not surrender the building. She simply decides when she is ready and not before what she chooses to build next. Sophia Sinclair had decided, and the land remembered everything.